Okay. So we are recording, and if you have to step out at some point, we will get this posted within about 24 hours or so on our Canvas page for this event. And I think we'll drop that link to our Canvas page in the chat here momentarily. But I'm going to start going because we have a lot to go through. There's a lot with accountability, not surprising. And we'll try not to overwhelm you. But let me get started here. So first of all, we are the Accountability and Data Literacy Unit. My name is Evan Bartelheim. I'm the project director. I'm joined by Dr. Hilary Weissman, who's our coordinator, as well as Karina Nahara. And I don't think Jeremy's joining us today. He's our data guy. We got him busy crunching the data right now. So, but we are here for you as a part of the Accountability and Support and Monitoring Division here at LACO, and we specialize in the dashboard and all things related to the data in the dashboard. So if you want, I have a QR code on the screen right now, but if you ever just want to sit down and talk with us one-on-one, please feel free to use our bookings tool to book a 15 or 30-minute call with us. We're happy to jump on and answer questions. Anything that we don't answer today, we're happy to do that for you. So today we're going to cover a lot, introductions and resources we'll get through in just a couple minutes. Then we're going to dive into some little elements I consider kind of the value added, because there's a lot of stuff the CD is going to be putting out in a couple weeks, no doubt, as the dashboard rolls out. And those things will be great. We'll be tuning in too. We encourage you to tune in. But we also like to talk a little bit about the data culture and best uses, best practices for data use. And in addition to just talking about what the dashboard consists of, because really it exists for a reason, and it's important to kind of put it into that context. So we're going to talk about data culture just for a few minutes, and we'll talk about just the fundamentals of the dashboard, where it comes from, breaking down the student groups. We have a new student group coming soon, not this year, but the following year, as well as breaking down each individual state indicator with methodology, and looking a little bit at the eligibility for assistance. We can't talk a great deal about CSI, ATSI, because some of that stuff gets identified after the fact, after the dashboard's published, but we'll talk about that. But then more importantly, and what kind of messaging should you prepare for your educational partners? So our learning objectives for today, we hope that you walk away with an increased understanding of the effective data culture, understand a little bit better the dashboard's foundational principle, why it exists and the purpose, increase your data literacy around the state indicators. We have a slide about data literacy. It really is, I was listening to a podcast today with Adam Grant, and he was saying, you know, on the learning continuum, right? Like we should always, there's no such thing as mastery. Every time I dive into this stuff, I feel like I'm learning something new. So learn something today, but you'll continue to learn in whatever your role, and we'll be on this journey with you. Also to provide some clarity around the eligibility criteria for state and federal assistance, and hopefully illuminate some of the best practices for connecting with your educational partners, how to frame that data conversation. I'm going to launch a really poll here, but we are curious, like what is on your mind? What is the indicator that you find most perplexing? You know, I just don't understand this indicator or the rules around it, or for which you have the greatest concern on the upcoming dashboard. Maybe just curious. You can pick more than one, but we'll just kind of take a look at where people's needs are, and maybe spend a little extra time within those indicators. Let's see. So here's what you said. The English Learner Progress, or the English Learner Progress Indicator, the LP, you know, hey, it's almost brand new. This is actually the first time we've seen the full LP, and it's a totally different one than we last saw in 2017. So yeah, I'd be very interested too, and I'm very interested in seeing the results this year. Chronic absenteeism, I think probably a lot of folks just want to see where are we related to last year, and just in looking at those chronic absentee reports, which of course are different than the dashboard, and we'll go into some of those differences, but the ones that were released on DataQuest, I did see a few of our LEAs, I think out of within LA County, that is, just looking at districts, we saw several for overall actually had an uptick in 2022-23 over the prior year when we thought it was the worst, right? So I'm very interested to see the results of that indicator as well. And then next on our list, we have kind of a tie there between the academic indicator and the college and career indicator, which, if you haven't seen the college and career indicator, depending on how long you've been in your role, and depending, I suppose, on what grade levels your LEA supports, you may or may not have ever seen the college and career indicators. That'll be interesting this year too. It'll just be a status, but it's good to see it back because I love that indicator. All right, so moving ahead, just a couple of key resources that we have thrown in here. We use these extensively. They're pretty wonky, but if you really want to get your hands dirty, definitely get that Connecting CalPaths to the Dashboard Handbook. Among the other things, it can actually give you a sense of how can I calculate my own dashboard before it's even released. There's some reports you can run from CalPaths. It's your data that's populating virtually all of the indicators on here, but you could really dive into suspension and to chronic absenteeism. You could actually have a pretty good idea what that looks like before the dashboard preview even. Also that CDE dashboard communication toolkit, we're using the 2022 pieces are being released kind of piecemeal, and you'll see them coming out probably in conjunction with the release. And then finally, we threw this in because I don't know, we think it's great, but you're definitely going to need it in the next few months, and we will be updating it. But we have a tool that we use in conjunction with our LCAP team called the LCAP Required Metrics Inventory. And we include all things dashboard, data quest, and CalPaths, so you can calculate the data you need for your LCAP and other accountability tools. I will note though, we were going to probably do some dives into like, oh, you can use this great tool to calculate your chronic absenteeism rate. We developed an Excel template, but in reality, it's coming out so soon. I don't really see the need to spend a lot of time on it. Maybe next year we'll start a little bit earlier, but we do have some previews. If you're the dashboard coordinator for your LEA, you will have received an email indicating this planned release. So November 14th, we'll see the English Learner Progress Indicator, the academic indicator, and then your local indicators, which hopefully you know because hopefully you submitted them yourself. November 28th will be chronic absenteeism grad rate, and then December 5th, suspension rate and college and career indicator. And then we will have the release on December 15th to the public. So, but take advantage of those to dive in, and those do actually allow you to get in and see those indicators for everybody. And if you're the dashboard coordinator, you'll get the login information sent to you directly. If you're not a dashboard coordinator, make sure you find out who that person is so you can find out and access the release information. So Hillary's going to take over, and I'm going to be driving. Just tell me when to advance, Hillary.
Yeah, I think before we got a little bit deeper into the dashboard in anticipation of its release, we wanted to take a moment and talk about data culture and the foundation of that. And keep in mind that if we just talk about data without providing any sort of context, somewhat do a disservice to our educational partners and internal staff when we're trying to share important information. But I noticed that we have on the next slide here, not a poll, but more in the chat. So before we kind of talk a little bit about data culture and the foundation, maybe in the chat, take a moment and identify what you consider a key indicator of a strong data culture within a school or a district. So if you're thinking about your district or your school, what are some key indicators that you have of a strong data culture? What are those characteristics? I see goals and conversations that are tied to outcomes. Agreed upon indicators. So data is regularly shared and used to make decisions, and that continuous cycle of improvement, consistently having data meetings with teachers, trust. Of course, without trust, the foundation of trust, it's hard to move forward. So as those are kind of populating and we move on to the next slide here, we kind of look at what is the leader's role in building a data culture? And kind of ensuring that data is used appropriately and effectively to make good decisions. It requires leadership, not only from system leaders like yourself, but it also requires, anyone who's taking the lead who's going to be using data to make decisions. And that can be teacher leaders, that can be technical assistants, it can be professional development leaders, test coordinators, and any other sort of educational partners. And there are some key ways that leaders can support the appropriate use of data for good decision making, including things such as building a common understanding, making sure that everyone is kind of on the same page. And I saw a few in the chat kind of underline or emphasize the ongoing consistent meetings around data, so everyone kind of has a common understanding. Aligning the data with your local mission, your vision, your equity goals, some of those things that you find in the LCAP or your strategic plan, or any sort of coherence plans you have. Supporting a shared vision for teaching and learning, and supporting really a culture of effective data use. So everyone kind of said this idea of continuous improvement, collaboration, and empowering people with regards to accountability. Leaders' role in data use practices should be guided by and directly supported, as we said, by a shared vision for teaching and learning. And as we said, also this emphasis on coherence, establishing a culture of continuous improvement, and it will help to support the educational communities and your partners when they engage and try to understand student outcomes and what the data means. And as Evan said, as you see on this next slide, this visual here, data literacy, it falls also underneath the leader's role when building a strong culture, but it's also on a continuum. Okay, integrating both the analysis and collaborative conversations around data, it's going to support building data literacy amongst staff, but it's also important to note that these don't occur separately, and they also fall, as you can see, on a scale here, and typically takes reflection, and it can be supported through growth by continuously coming back to it, reflecting upon our practices. And as Evan mentioned previously in a podcast he was listening to, mastery similarly is on a continuum, and everyone is always growing and learning. So as we get into some dashboard fundamentals, we wanted to make sure that we kind of ground you in the dashboard as more than just an online tool that's designed to help communities access information. It's around K through 12 schools and dashboards, but we really wanted to focus on, around the 10 foundational principles that were kind of created around the dashboard. And without reading all of them to you, but kind of focusing on 4 that stand out to us, center around the focus on using an equity lens and support building capacity amongst all of our student groups and with our educational partners. Also really leveraging the decision-making abilities and the engagement around student performance and what that means and what that looks like. One of the other important principles that the dashboard emphasizes is there's this value on high performance and growth equally. And lastly, one of the other things that is continuously kind of repeated in the chat and we spoke about for a strong data culture is this focus on continuous improvement and needing to reflect. So where does the dashboard fit into the California's accountability and continuous improvement system? So this visual here is used to kind of explain overall how it fits into the accountability system, but the dashboard itself is used to promote continuous improvement for all student groups across all indicators. Additionally, the dashboard is used by the CDE to distinguish schools that meet things such as the blue ribbon requirements and the distinguished school programs. The dashboard also, it's used to make and support determinations for both our state and local accountability systems under the LCFF formula. State indicator data are also used to determine which schools are eligible for comprehensive support and improvement, or CSI and ATSI. And the data are used to inform things like the LCAP and the SIPSA goals for future iterations of the dashboard, and actions are put into place to monitor those performance for improvement purposes. The data is then, as you can see here in this visual, gathered from the actions, analyzed, and subsequently submitted for the following year's dashboard. And I know that we have like a return to color coming back and everyone is very excited, except for our college and career indicator. But I thought that this slide here kind of captures the summary of those dashboards and indicators over time. It's a sort of review and reflection that provides a little bit more of a comprehensive overview. And at a first glance, I think when I was talking with Evan, to someone who was novice like myself, when I initially looked at this a few years ago, I was taken back because it seemed somewhat unstable to me. It seemed rather, the indicators, they weren't really fully represented. And in some cases, like the English language progress indicator, you know, it was using the CELT. And so I had trouble kind of wrapping my mind around it. And I said to him, you know, I want to find the thread. And what's interesting was the conclusion that we came to was the misconception I had with regards of what I was actually looking at and the true value that resides in the consistency of that fluctuation. And really the data that's needed to create both the status and change, in addition to the suspension of the data that's required that we had during the pandemic. And so I was really able to kind of see that although we haven't had a fully populated all color for indicators yet, this is the closest. Really looking at the data that is pushed through each of these indicators gives a better appreciation for the dashboard and what it measures. So as we unpack these indicators in the next few sections, we're going to dig in a little bit deeper into the rules around the status and change. We're going to get a little bit of more clarity around the fluctuation I was speaking to, as well as some ease in knowing that these indicators will be coming back in full color, except for the college and career indicator, which we'll be looking at as status. So how do you get performance level? Okay, so color. So to help parents and educators identify strengths and areas for improvement, California reports on how districts and schools, including alternative schools and student groups, are performing across state and local measures. For state measures, performance is based upon two factors, as you can see in the slide. Status, which is the current year results, ranging from very high to very low, and change, which is whether the results improved from the prior year and are identified by levels ranging from increase significantly to decline significantly. As we get back to color here, performance on state measures uses comparative statewide data. And as you can see on the top image here in this slide, our 2023 dashboard will be returning to color. So as I said, bye-bye to 2022 purple cell phone bars that previously only captured status, and hello to status and change, which will no doubt give us and everyone else a very colorful dashboard. As a reminder, a gauge indicator displays colors ranging from the lowest performance of red to the highest performance, which is blue. In cases where there are fewer than 30 students in any year, a grayed out color dial with the words no performance color will be in place of the traditional color dial. And I know Evan will be speaking more specifically to the smaller populations in the next few slides. But now if we look at the image on the bottom here and direct our attention to the slide here, let's see, there are 5 local performance indicators that are also incorporated in this dashboard. And today we're going to be focusing on those, although I know that we also have we'll be focusing on the state measures, and our local ones, which are met or not met, we'll be covering at another workshop in time. Trying to see, Evan, if there's anything else I missed here, or if there were any other questions at the time.
No questions.
Alrighty, so let's move on to talk to us a little bit about the color grids and the types we're going to have.
I will do that. I do appreciate the changes too, Hillary. I think that's kind of interesting among the dashboard principles, that final one, which was it's continuously improving and changing. So even the dashboard is subject to continuous improvement. And I think this year we saw a lot. We'll talk about some of the changes that are forthcoming around the LP and some of also some stuff that's projected out in the not too distant future. The 5x5, everybody probably has seen these. I've got to say, I actually somehow it blew right by me. I don't know what I was doing, but I kind of missed that there was a separate 5x5 introduced a few years ago. So we have the traditional 5x5, which you see on the left. But then a couple of years ago, the state board adopted a balanced 5x5. And this just, both of these reflect that the combination of that performance level and the change. And again, that dashboard principle of valuing growth and change, or growth and status equally. High performance would be your status, and then growth would be your change. So what the balanced is only applied to the academic indicator. All the other indicators use a traditional 5x5 grid. The difference, as I've come to learn, is actually really kind of boils down to the fluctuations that a small population is subject to. So if you have a really small student population that's still eligible for criteria, or they have the eligibility for accountability because they have 30 more students. If you've got a few students, can really swing that one way or another. And what the academic indicator, when they shifted to a balance, it really kind of flattened that out a little bit. And as you can see, in any given status level, there are only 2 potential colors you could arrive at, whereas the traditional 5x5, you could actually, if you look at the high status, potentially you could have 1 of 4 colors depending on what the change was. So you could see where that could be subject to some significant swings. It's still applied to all of the indicators, like I said, except the academic indicator. And I think it was actually part of the discussion around the English Learner Progress Indicator, because there were some small groups, I think some concern over small schools or schools that had a small population of English learners being disproportionately hit with they've had a significant change. However, there is a 3x5, and this has been the response in the past for schools or LEAs where they have a population that's less than 150 students. And it's applied to the grad rate, suspension rate, chronic absenteeism, and college and career indicator. This year, of course, we won't have a 5x5 because we only have status for the CCI. But what you can see here is it actually eliminates those 2 columns, both the increase significantly from prior year and the decline significantly. So essentially that eliminates the potential for big swings. So if you have a smallish student group, you have less of a concern of being identified. Now, what's interesting is you don't really see this until it's on the back end. And so this is actually applied, it's only applied actually if you do have a small student group that ends up falling if their cut score, if they get into the increased or decreased significantly cut score. It won't appear on the dashboard as such. You won't see it on your landing page. It'll just say increased or decreased. Won't say significantly. And you may look at the cut score and go, wait a minute, isn't that percentage, wouldn't that have fallen into the decrease significantly? And if you drill down, you'll actually can find it deep within the additional data reports. There's some reporting that'll show you if the small group 3x5 was applied for you. So just keep that in mind in case you see anything perplexing. I think sometimes things show up on the dashboard and you're like, people are asking, but this doesn't match up. Why does it, especially on that front facing, it may be that you have a small student group for which this was applied. Also just note that, the 5x5s, and we're going to go, as we go through, we'll point out which ones have it, but some of the 5x5s include 5x5s for both the LEA type and the school type. So you have elementary school districts, high school districts, and unified school districts. You also have different 5x5s for some of the elementary school, middle school, and high school. So we'll point those out when we get there. There is an appendix. It's already been posted for the upcoming 2023 dashboard. It's linked here for all the 5x5 color grids, but we threw them into the back of this presentation as an appendix. So, and don't freak out. We're not going to go through all 120 slides or whatever we have on there. But let's talk a little bit about the student groups, because understanding student groups is actually can be a challenge at times, and understanding who's included, who's not. So the state indicators break down by race, ethnicity, the student groups of Black, American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Filipino, Hispanic or Latino, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, white, or 2 or more races. And for the student groups, we look at English learners, foster youth, homeless students, long-term English learners is the new one. It's not, and I'm going to talk about a little bit more in just a second. It won't appear on this upcoming dashboard though. So I know this is already an ed code, but it doesn't specify, but I've talked to the CDE just this week, and they confirmed it's a 2024 dashboard for which this long-term English learners will appear. And then socioeconomically disadvantaged and students with disabilities. And these are all the student groups that are laid out in Ed Code 52052, which is all the accountability language. So just to talk about that LTEL for a minute, I see some of my friends from LA Unified on here. They got a preview of this slide earlier. Yeah, this is a little bit weird because many of you know that we've had this definition that's been around for a while related to LTELs, and it includes student grade 6 through 12. They've been enrolled in a school in the United States for 6 or more years. They've remained at the same English proficiency level on the LPAC, I guess, prior to that, for 2 or more consecutive years. And if they're in grades 6 through 9, they've scored either far below basic or below basic on the prior year's English language arts summative assessment. I think that the terminology far below basic or below basic will tell you how long this has been in Ed Code, right? That's been around since STAR testing. But so it's a little bit of an older one, but that's still what we've been using for data quests for LTEL reports, as well as the file that's released. So, it's like, okay, so now we're going to track LTELs. Well, the new Ed Code that came about after Senate Bill 114 was passed last summer amended that, just the accountability section. So that 313.1 is still an Ed Code, but now we have this new section in which English LTELs are identified as a student who's not attained English language proficiency within 7 years of the initial classification as an English learner. So that's considerably different. Like I said, this won't appear till 2024 dashboard, but the CDE is planning to provide some additional guidance, because I've asked about this a couple times, and there's a lot of questions like, will LTELs be its own would it be a subgroup under the LP? You'd have English learners and LTELs, so this is all stuff that really has to probably at least be knocked around the CDE for some additional guidance, but stay tuned. We'll get you more information about that, but you won't see this and you won't have to speak to this for this dashboard. You won't have to explain who these students are quite yet. Then in terms of the required group size for accountability, to be considered for accountability, which is to get a color in most cases, you have to have a student group with a denominator of 30 or more. And that has to be both in the current year and in the prior year. So you'll see sometimes you'll have 30 this year and you're like, but why is there no color on the dashboard? That's probably because if it's a smallish student group, that might have been prone to some fluctuation. The prior year, you might have had less than 30. There is an exception though for districts. That is homeless and foster youth are included for accountability if they have 15 or more. For schools, however, it's always 30 or more. So homeless and foster at the school level has to be 30 or more. Now, the tricky part is the denominator is kind of different. It differs for each one. And sometimes people see like, this is not adding up. How come I have this many English learners on the academic indicator and this many on suspension rate? Well, first of all, like academic indicators only looking at specific grades in which students are tested. You also have some inclusion rules that are for academic about enrollment that we'll get to. But so there's a lot of factors that go into that, but just know in general, 30 or more. Now, if you don't have 30, let's say you have between 11 and 29, you do get a baseball card on the front that gives you the data is presented. You just don't see the colors. You don't see the little multicolored dashboard logo. But you do get the status and change data is published and it is included in the data files if you're downloading that. There's just no performance color, and that's supposed to be the visual way to indicate that this student group is not, this LEA is not being held accountable for that student group on the dashboard. Then, of course, if it's less than 11 students, as always applies elsewhere, they don't publish anything just for the sake of anonymity. And just a note for charter schools, if we have any charter school folks here, that charter schools are treated as schools for the purposes of reporting homeless and foster youth. So they have to have 30 or more as well. One other piece, this came out actually, this was out originally pre-pandemic, this rule, then it applied in full for the first time last year, but this District of Special Ed Accountability, and I don't see any of my friends from Las Virgenes here, but boy, that really caught everybody off guard there. The District of Special Ed Accountability last year when they were publishing it, this wasn't originally factored into the ESSA file. And so a couple of districts around the state, including Las Virgenes, suddenly got identified, because what happens is for the purposes of accountability at the LEA level, those students with disabilities who are shared with another district for the purposes of receiving services may be reassigned to their district of residence, right? So they get sent back basically for the dashboard, and that's what happens. So some students in Las Virgenes, for example, were receiving services either probably maybe from another local district, but for the purposes of accountability, they get sent back to the dashboard of the district where they reside. So in most cases, it's the reporting LEA and the District of Special Ed Accountability are one and the same. And there's also usually the same. So you don't see a lot of fluctuation there, just a few. But I do know some of our folks on here, I see a couple who do have this apply, and we've kind of sorted through it and like, well, the numbers aren't adding up. It's like, oh yeah, you got this case, like I know one district that has this inter-district, has a small school with inter-district transfers, right? And so the question is, who's responsible? So the student resides in District A, but they have an agreement with District B. In this case, it's kind of an unusual exception, but District B is the one that gets the accountability. Within CalPADS, there is an extract for the District of Special Ed Accountability that gives you student names. If you want to know who the students are in terms of how it's calculated, I definitely would ask for that because it may help you understand a little bit if the numbers don't jive with what you're thinking you should be seeing. And there's a link on here for looking at some of the additional scenarios that you might come across with that. So now we're going to dive right into those state indicators and understanding the methodologies. And Hillary, you're up. You're muted, Hillary. Hillary, you're muted.
Sorry, there we go. I have some private messages going on, and so as a reminder, I want to let everyone know that we are recording this, including the part where I'm on mute, and we will be uploading it to our Canvas page for you to have access to either later today or tomorrow. But as Evan said, we're going to kind of jump right in here. Let's take a moment here and talk about the 2023 chronic absenteeism indicator. So what is this indicator? And I know that we can all remember, but just for clarification, it's the percentage of students who are absent for 10% or more of the instructional days that they were enrolled to attend. And it includes students in kindergarten through 8th grade that are expected to attend at least 31 of those days at the school. Absences include, as you can see, excused, unexcused, out of school, suspensions, and non-ADA generating independent study days. And are captured in the student absence summary or the stats as part of CalPADS. On the 2023 dashboard, this will include the transitional kindergarten or TK, as CalPADS combines TK and kindergarten as attending a program rather than grade. And to calculate the performance, both status and change are used, as we know, and status is calculated by taking the number of students who are currently or who are chronically absent during the 2022 and 23 academic year and dividing them by the total number of eligible cumulatively enrolled students. Then to determine the change, you're going to take the current year status and subtract that from the prior years. What I did want to do is take a moment and zoom in on this baseball style graphic that we all know and are somewhat familiar with that will be returning this year. This will be the first level of information that's kind of provided to schools and LEAs and other educational partners when they visit the dashboard. And this particular card, as you can see here, reports results of a school or LEA's chronic absenteeism. The gauge that you're looking at, it shows 5 different performance levels. And as you can see on this one, that the orange is what's being pointed to. Below that, though, just for acquaintance purposes on this image, you can see the reporting status and change. And in this example, the status shows a chronic absenteeism rate of 10.1% and an increase of 1.1% points. And then at the bottom, and more importantly, I think, and we're going to kind of go into this at the very end of our presentation, is that equity report, which kind of shows the numbers of student groups in each performance level or color. And as you can see on this one, we have 2 groups that are in yellow performance and 8 in orange, and looks like 3 in red. And then at the very, very bottom is a link to view more reports with specific information, which once again, we're kind of dive into at the end of our presentation. But getting back to the color grid here, I think the idea is that this is one of those color grids where it only has one set of cut scores for kindergarten through 8th grade in all schools and districts. Similarly to the suspension indicator, which we'll see coming up next, where the desired outcome is reversed, most indicators, as we know, strive for high performance levels, such as we'd see on the graduation rate or on academic assessments. However, the goal of the chronic absenteeism rate is to achieve a low rate and a decreased rate in change. As Evan mentioned previously, the 5x5 tables provide performance levels of a school, LEA, or student group, with the top row representing the change from prior year, and the possible change levels for the top row, as you can see, range from increasing significantly to decline significantly. And the first column contains the status in the current year and ranges from very low to very high. The intersection of the change and the status is what's going to give you that performance level or color. And in the example you're looking at here of the 5x5 chart, to receive a blue performance level, an LEA or a school or student group would need one of the following combinations: a status of very low and a change level of either maintained, declined, or declining significantly, or a status level of low and a change level of decline significantly. So before we move slides, I wanted to take a moment and talk about the automatic assignment of an orange color. So LEAs that do not certify their CalPADS end of year data or had more full day out of school suspensions than the number of days reported as absences will have their performance level automatically assigned to orange if they have 30 or more students enrolled to attend. LEAs submit student data for their students, as well as the school within the LEA will also be assigned in orange. So this rule has been applied across multiple dashboards. However, LEAs and their schools were automatically assigned a status level of high in 2022, since colors were not available then. A red performance level is assigned if the LEA or school's own chronic absenteeism data places them at this performance color. And in these instances, the LEA or school will continue to receive a red performance level and will not be auto-assigned an orange color. So in total, the 2023 dashboard will reflect the return of performance colors, the 5x5 and the 3x5 grid, and the automatic assignment of orange.
The good news, Hillary, is that none of our LEAs failed to get their end of year submissions certified this year. So way to go.
Congratulations.
But we're monitoring that closely because it was a concern, and there's some other implications moving forward, but everybody got theirs in.
So a lot of people, we try to create a little chart here to distinguish the differences between DataQuest and the dashboard. And we know that many schools in our LEAs use both DataQuest and the dashboard to understand their data. However, DataQuest and the dashboard calculate and present data in different ways. Some of the differences include the grade levels when reporting. On DataQuest, using filters, one can access chronic absenteeism reports for grades K through 12, whereas the dashboard, as we said, reports for grades K through 8. DataQuest also includes charter schools in their district's authorizers reports, with filters available to include or exclude charters from the authorizers reports. However, the dashboard always has charter schools excluded from their authorizers results, since charter schools are considered LEAs for accountability purposes. Additionally, DataQuest and the dashboard differ on how students with disabilities are reported. On DataQuest, students with disabilities are reported at the district of attendance, whereas on the dashboard, they are reported at the district of residence. And lastly, DataQuest reports broad reasons for absences for the state LEAs and schools, whereas the dashboard does not report on absenteeism by reason. However, it does provide link to the absenteeism by reason reports and DataQuest, so that you can go there and check those out. Now, I know as we kind of move through our indicators, we always come across frequently asked questions, both that arise in the tech guides, but also some that just kind of come into us. And before we move on to the next indicator, I know Evan and I want to take a moment to kind of review a few of the most frequently asked questions we received.
Well, we actually had a question in the chat, so let's answer that one first. David had a great question, which is, will the cutoffs ever be changed for status and or change? For example, chronic absenteeism due to the effects of the pandemic. And so it's a great question. There's actually a lot of folks last year who were calling for a change to the cut scores based on, well, everyone, what everybody was experiencing. And I think the policy at the time, or what CDE noted, was that, and they do consider this. They use there's several groups: the technical design group, the practitioners advisor group, who all look at this and weigh in, and then the board makes the final decision. And they decided it was an anomaly, but better to let it ride out to return, or at least to see if it's going to return, to have some standards against which to compare it to prior years. And now we're starting to see it's probably not going to change. What will happen, they will consider, and they have changed cut scores in the past, and it's important to understand the way cut scores are established. They actually are, there's not like it's not a norm referenced thing, right? They're not saying everybody should be this percentage point. What they look at is the initial data that comes in. They look at the distribution of all LEAs across the state, and then they try to historically find where is that 5% mark for the highest performing, whatever the highest level, highest status is, and then the lowest performing, the lowest status level. And they try to basically create a bell curve so that along those lines, and they apply that. So if it starts to shift radically over time, and for instance, we start to see chronic absenteeism become more chronic, I'm sure that they would consider revising or looking at those to renew it with an eye towards being equitable and fair distribution. Because the point is not, oh, here's everybody's got to meet this standard. And this came up before with the English Learner Progress Indicator and calls to change those cut scores. Basically, it's always the policy for all indicators that they look at a distribution of all LEAs within the state and their performance, and then they look at the historical distribution and they try to find that spot where it makes sense, right? And so when we get into identification for support, it's really based around who needs the greatest level of support, right? And so if you have too many schools falling within that, and I guess this could apply last year because we had so many schools identified for ATSI and so many districts identified for differentiated assistance, it really became kind of almost impossible to provide a level of assistance to those, whether you were the LAA providing the assistance or the county providing assistance. So yeah, that's when they would reconsider those. So great question, David. Probably didn't expect that.
Actually, I think that question is a good segue, because the questions that are up here, we have them linked to the FAQ on the 2022 dashboard technical guide, and we've reviewed them already. But for sake of time, if we can, let's jump forward to suspension. And although that wasn't the highest of concerns on everyone's when we were pulling them earlier, just to review, the suspension rate indicator shows the percentage of students who have an aggregate suspension length of at least one full day in kindergarten through grade 12, anytime during the school year. Schools and student groups with 30 or more students enrolled for at least one day anytime during the current year and prior year will receive a performance level for this indicator. And similarly to the chronic absenteeism indicator, the desired outcome for the suspension rate is also reversed, and the goal is to achieve a low suspension rate. And just like we reviewed in chronic absenteeism, there are some distinctions between the data on DataQuest and on the dashboard, with both how they're calculated and how they're presented. With regards to the suspension rate, the differences can be seen in the length of the suspension. In DataQuest, regardless of the length of the suspension, they are included in the calculation, whereas the dashboard uses an aggregate suspension of one full day. Likewise, in DataQuest, students that attend non-public schools are counted in the calculation, but on the dashboard, they are not. And lastly, and again, similarly to the chronic absenteeism indicator and the differences in reporting, charter schools are included in their authorizers report, although they can be filtered out, filtered in on DataQuest. On the dashboard, charter schools are treated as LEAs under LCFF and therefore are not included in their authorizers report. I think lastly, DataQuest and the dashboard differ in how students with disabilities are reported, as we mentioned previously. Looking at the, so let's talk about the color grid for the suspension rate indicator without going into as much detail as previously. It's divided into both change and status, with the intersection identifying the performance level colors. As a reminder, the suspension rate indicator applies to schools specific grids, so elementary, middle, and high school, in addition to LEA specific grids for elementary, high school, and unified school districts. all of which are included in the appendix of this presentation. And additionally, the automatic assignment of orange is also applied. Okay. Now I haven't seen anything in the chat. I'm not sure if you have, Evan. Let me open it up.
No questions about this one, but we did have, these are some of the frequently asked questions. Again, these are in the dashboard technical guide. We were using the 2022, they're there, but you may find them again in when they publish the updated ones. So Hillary, if a student transfers from one school to another, do the student suspensions follow that student?
No, the student suspensions would count in the first school, but not at the second school. As with all the state indicators, the state data used for the dashboard are based upon the data generated at each district or school, and an LEA or school does not inherit another LEA or school's data.
What about if that student is transferring within an LEA, they're transferring schools within an LEA, does the LEA get affected?
I don't know.
Well, the LEA gets it, right?
Oh,
So that's pretty
yeah.
common, right? So so if your student is transferring, he's got, because he was suspended perhaps, but the LEA still, that student would not be, if he got suspended again, it would only show up one time, within the LEA level, because multiple times at different school sites doesn't add up. It's still one student unduplicated. So
And just keep in mind, partial day suspensions with regards to full day suspensions, and that only students with an aggregate suspension of 1 full day are counted as suspension.
And this is all, I mean, when you look at your suspension rate, I would, sometimes I recommend choosing dashboard data over DataQuest data for certain things in your LCAP. We looked at a couple district level reports for this, and it's so small as to be almost, that it has no effect on the percentage, but we looked at one fairly good sized district, and they had one different in terms of the numerator. It was 264 in the dashboard, 265 in DataQuest, and the difference was a student who was suspended for a partial day, right? They get included in DataQuest, but it didn't change the percentage at all. But you may want to look at that just to see if partial day suspensions may have pushed one rate higher than the other. Maybe one's a little more favorable. Not saying, use the one that's more favorable necessarily, but understanding the difference. So if somebody points out discrepancies, you can understand why they may exist. So English Learner Progress Indicator. It's a great one. So we did see a lot of people are interested in this. And of course, there's been a lot of changes. So just in September, the state board made some final changes to approve the LP. They approved the change cut scores and the 5x5 grid. Those were established. Like I said, there were some calls to revise or to consider the status cut scores, and the state board declined to do that. So the status cut scores are the same as they were last year. Additionally, the state board approved how students who take the summative alternate LPAC are included in the LP calculation. So just like on the academic indicator, it includes both the summative LPAC and then the summative alternate LPAC. And it is a little bit tricky to include the performance of the students who take the summative alternate LPAC because it doesn't have the scale scores don't have the same linear progression. They basically go up at their 3 separate levels. So they kind of landed on one a methodology that allows kind of a win-win. Like, so changing performance levels would have been, just looking at the data, it apparently didn't amount to a lot of students showing progress. So in addition to changing a performance level, because they're not subdividing the summative LPAC the way they do the LPAC or the LP, a student can progress by changing levels or by increasing the scale score 10 or more points. So both ways will achieve progress for a student in taking the summative alternate LPAC. So that was good for LEAs. So in terms of how it's calculated, you all probably know this, but again, it applies only to schools who have 30 more LPAC summative assessment takers in grades 1 through 12, with an overall performance level in both current and prior years. So kindergartners are only included in the calculation for participation rate, but they wouldn't have 2 years, right? Unless they took it in TK, which is now changing things up. We'll see how that affects it moving forward. But for the purposes of the LP, it's final LP is based on grades 1 through 12. You have to have students with the student group of 30 or more. So the formula basically is the summative assessment takers who increased one LP performance level, or including the alternate who either increased one performance level or added 10 points, plus those takers who maintained the LP level 4, and there's no equivalent on the summative alternate LPAC, and that's divided by the all takers who had both the current year and a prior year result. And of course, they subdivide that into 6 levels. The LP has 6 levels. They subdivide levels 2 and 3 from LPAC into 2 low, 2 high, and 3 low and 3 high. So students have to make progress each year through that. So now LP status. So last year we only saw LP status, and that's measuring the rate that EL students are moving towards proficiency, and that does require 2. But now we've got the 3 consecutive years. So now we look at last year's rate versus this year's rate. So it's going to be a little bit different. So we want to see, did those students, did your LP go up a little bit, right? One consideration, this is another thing that the state board approved, which is a change to the participation rate penalty. So similar to the Smarter Balance, the 95% participation rate is required for accountability purposes. Of course, 100% participation rate is required for Title III, but for the dashboard, 95% participation rate required under ESSA. And if it's not met, a penalty has to be applied. Last year, the penalty was automatic assignment of low status. And it didn't matter whether you were 94% participation rate or 74% participation rate. So it wasn't very equitable. So they modified the penalty to align the punishment now should fit the crime, right? So what you end up looking at is any student, first of all, a student who logged into at least one domain in each of the composites is counted as participating. So you look at the total of the summative takers in grades K through 12, divided by your total enrolled EL students during that window, and that'll give you the participation rate. So now, if you are shy of that participation rate, of the 95%, and they have to round down now, by the way, so that was a Department of Education requirement, no more rounding up. So if you had to round down, right, so then you'd have to add as many students to the denominator as would be needed to bring up that participation rate to 95%. And so in this sample below, you'd have to add 13. Basically, you enter 13 students in the denominator, which is the equivalent of saying 13 students who did not progress. Right, so it's a kind of a blunt instrument. So this could have a big impact if you didn't meet your participation rate. Fortunately, most folks are really good in making sure everybody gets tested. And keep in mind, the participation rate also includes your kindergartners taking the summative. Even though they aren't included in the final LP, they are included for the purposes of calculating the participation rate because you have to get 95% of them as well. So just the English learner progress indicator here is a screenshot of the new beautiful 5x5. There's only one, and it's traditional. And I point this out because this was a conversation that took place at the state board. As I mentioned earlier, the traditional 5x5 can sometimes be a little more subject to volatility for those small LEAs, or not necessarily small LEAs, but LEAs that have a small population. So some schools or districts that have very few English learners may find, that if they had a low status, but they declined significantly, they could end up in the red this year. And I think the preliminary data showed of the 423 LEAs who fell in here, I think about 400 had a population below 150. So that could be a factor, and the state board did recognize that and said they would consider a 3x5 moving forward. There is not, however, a 3x5 currently. So that's what it is for right now. So the questions, do we have any? I don't see any questions popping up, but just from the FAQs, who's counted as participating? I think I kind of covered that. Like a student has to at least log in to one of the domains in each of the composites, right? So there's 4 domains. They have to log into one within reading, writing, like blanking on my LPAC right now, sorry. Speaking and listening is one of the domains. Reading and writing is the other composite. So one domain within each one of those. Hillary, student who doesn't take the LPAC because they're scheduled to be reclassified before May 31st, are they included in the participation rate? You're muted again, sorry.
Hang on, I have computer malfunction at the moment. Hang on.
Oh, okay, well, I'll keep going. So this actually came up a lot last year. I know in our Dan group, if a student, if a student was not reclassified before that February 1st date, but they were eligible to be reclassified based on a prior year's LPAC score of level 4, and then they were reclassified within that within the testing window, they would not be included. If they're RFEP within that testing window, they're removed. The state removes anybody whose ELAS changes to RFEP within the testing window. If you didn't get them reclassified before May 31st, if something happened, that would be more problematic. What did drive people crazy here last year was the fact that once the testing window opened, there were students who had been reclassified, but they hadn't been reclassified because CalPADS didn't get around to changing the ELAS before that opening of the LPAC window. This year, however, the CD and ETS have changed the rules, so it should be easier. Students will be removed based on the date that's entered for the change. So if they were given an ELAS on January 20th, but it doesn't get entered in CalPADS till after February 1st, they'll get removed from the ETS. So they won't hover around within your TOMs forever, driving your coordinators, your testing coordinators crazy. All right, I'm going to move forward here. Academic indicator, another heavy duty one. So academic indicator is based on both the Smarter Balanced Summative and the California alternate assessments. And this one is a little bit unique in that it pulls the data from ETS and the extract from CalPADS. So you're not really able to get all your data quite as readily like you could with just the straight up suspension information. But we did have a tool, and I'll add it later. You won't need it probably because your academic indicator preview is coming up. But we did have a tool that our friends at SCOE produced that actually allowed you to drop your TOMS file in here to give you, and it gave you a predictive DFS, which was kind of handy. So that's definitely something to look for and possibly use next year. So what does that distance from standard represent? So that's that difference between the student's score on the Smarter Balance and the standard met achievement level threshold for the grade that they're entered in, right? And the DFS is calculated for both Smarter Balance and for the California alternate assessment. So now currently CAST is not included in the distance from standard. People have asked that before, but it may be in the future. We'll get there in a minute. For the DFS calculation for the California alternate assessments, this is pretty weedy, but if somebody asks how they do that, because of course the CAA has just the 3 performance levels, how do they align that? So what they did is it's called the top of the range model. So wherever it scores, whatever performance level a student lands in on the Cal Alt, they give that student the highest score of the equivalent performance level of the CASP. So in the case of, there are 4 levels, right? So you're not going to have anybody at the highest level of level 4. But if a student were to score level 3 on the Cal Alt, they would assign them the highest scale score in level 3 for the equivalent grade in CASP. So in the example I give here, if a student in 4th grade on the ALA Cal Alt scored a level 2, they're going to convert that to the highest scale score in level 2 on the Smarter Balance. So basically a -1 distance from standard because level 2 goes right up to that mark, right? So that's how they calculate it. It is important to note, though, this is one that kind of throws people off because you look at your CASP results that are out right now and you go, well, I'm counting all these kids. Why aren't they included? First of all, to be included in that DFS calculation, a student has to be continuously enrolled. Okay, so students who are not continuously enrolled are removed from the calculation. And to be continuously enrolled means you have an enrollment record on Census Day, which is that first Wednesday in October. And when you all the way through to when you log into the test without a gap of 30 or more consecutive days. So, if a student came to you after the Census Day, they wouldn't be included. And this primarily benefits folks because if you had a student who showed up in January or February before your testing window opened, you basically had no real influence on the student's academic achievement for the year, so that student's not included for the sake of accountability. And then again, the participation rate. This actually was pretty surprisingly important last year. A lot of LEAs and schools were kind of hammered by this, and I think it's partially because it's so difficult to track in real time. But just like I mentioned before, per ESSA, all LEAs, schools, and student groups have to meet a 95% participation rate for academic assessments. And under the academic indicator, if that participation rate isn't met, a lowest obtainable scale score, or a loss, is assigned to each student who is needed to bring that participation rate up for the school, for the district, or for the student group up to 95%. Now, the loss is kind of set in stone. So there's, for ELA, the loss would be, for participation rate, is a minus 333. For math, it's minus 348. And I will note that you could actually have an earned loss as well, right? So this is an automatic loss for participation rate, but a student who logged in and didn't want to answer anything, or just messed around, could actually have, in many instances, a lower lowest obtainable scale score, because they do vary by grade levels. But for the participation rate, the penalty is fixed at these particular distances from standard. And it's the number of students tested, right? And so to be included in the testing, they would have had to log on to both parts of the test, both the computer adaptive test and the performance task of the Smarter Balanced, in the same content area. So you couldn't do one CAT of one and a PT of another. So or you would have to log into the CalAlt. So there are some participation rate exemptions. The one that probably most people are familiar with, well, actually, all of these probably a lot of you are familiar with, because you're a seasoned crowd here. But any students who transfer out of your LEA within that beginning grace period, that 14-day grace period, you're not held accountable for that student. Or if they come into your LEA at the end of the grace period, the last 14 days, they aren't included. So that's helpful. When does that start? That's an important thing. We always stress this. I think one of our assessment colleagues is here right now. Is it starts when students first log in. Any student within the LEA logs into that first test of the Smarter Balanced summative. So one of the reasons why you don't want to have your assessment window open as long as possible is that people can inadvertently log in to that first test when they're thinking they're signing into an interim assessment, and that starts your test window. It opens your test window for accountability purposes. So hopefully your accountability or assessment folks have dialed that in. They aren't doing that. But if you have a student who comes to you within that accountability testing window, you are responsible for them, even if they showed up that late. You are responsible for the participation rate. They won't show up in the DFS calculation because they don't have continuous enrollment, but you have to test them for your participation rate. Also excluded are students who have a medical emergency, those that have a NTE code in TOMS, and any English learners who are enrolled in U.S. school for less than a year. They can take the test, but it's automatically pulled out of the calculation for participation rates. They are required to take it if they were entered in the year April 15th of the prior year or later. Here's your 5x5s again. Again, these are specific to different both schools and your district type. There is no longer, there used to be a different 5x5. I'm sure most of you who have these schools, the dashboard alternative schools, the DOS methodology was included for grad rate, used to be included for grad rate and academic indicator. The U.S. Department of Ed said no more of that. They declined the waiver. So we don't have a specific 5x5 for DOS anymore for these. But if you're talking to any of your folks, site folks, just make sure they're pulling the right 5x5, because there's a lot of them. It's easy to get lost in there. This, I honestly didn't think we had anybody, but I think I see my pal Sarah on here, Sarah Nitzos from Weisburn. She was the first one who came to me and said, tell me about this parent share thing. And I had always just blown right by this part of the technical guide, but Weisburn has one of the schools. It's a parent share school. And just a heads up, if you're like Sarah, next year, let your principal of that parent share school know to check their email throughout the summer, because what happens is, for the parent share, essentially they're required by federal eligibility to be assigned distance from standard for grade 3. Of course, these are schools that only serve K-1 or K through 2. They don't have third graders. So what they do is they automatically, they'll let you identify the 3 schools to which the students most frequently matriculate, and then they'll get a blended DFS from those schools. Or if you don't respond, if you're like a principal who takes the first month of summer off and you get an email that you don't respond to, because your inbox is, got a return response, then they just automatically assign you to the county DFS. So, or to the district DFS first, and then the county, depending. So, it's not very common, but we do have a few K1 or K2 individual schools, and that's why that exists. Future, this is really exciting, I will say, I think, and especially if you are a science person. So the state board is definitely interested in modifying the academic indicator in the future, maybe in a 2024 dashboard, in 2 ways. They want to incorporate the California science test, which, that's kind of would be, I guess it would be a little bit challenging because, you've got the grades 5, 8, and then all high school. It would be a little bit trickier to incorporate it. But that would be included. And then there's a student level growth model that California produced. We saw the preliminary model of it a few years ago. I think it was like right at the beginning of the pandemic. But it requires 3 years worth of data. So they haven't been able to generate it since, but they will be able to generate it next year in 2024. So I think the state board is interested in revising the academic indicator in the future to include both the ELA math and then adding science, and then incorporating that student level growth model for ELA and math. That's all it's currently will be calculated for. So more will come about that. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, Sarah, the email goes out mid-July, response window closes. It's not a terrible thing if you're a small district like Wiseburn and they assign that parent share to your, because it's small, but if you're a big district and they're giving their defaulting to the district average, it might be not very reflective of the students who are at that K1 too. So some frequently asked questions from here. Just that first one, why are CASP results not matching the results of the dashboard? Well, they're very different rules, right? So, and we've actually, we've been looking through the CASP results and seeing some growth, but they're not exactly the same rules. Who's included for the purposes of CASP includes any student who took the test. Those students might be excluded from your dashboard for a variety of reasons, including not having had continuous enrollment, as we talked about. If a newcomer accidentally took the ELA test, they will not be included in that DFS calculation. They're automatically taken out. Even if they take it on purpose, they're not included for the dashboard. This one we kind of talked about, the student leaving the school before the testing window, but continue to appear in TOMS. They don't affect your participation rate, but that's an important distinction, right? So there's completion rate is reported in TOMS, and there's participation rate, 2 very different things. And I think a couple of our LEAs did a pretty good job this year building some in hacking the system to be able to kind of, figure out individual student groups participation rate, because they're like, well, if you look, this file has demographic data, and this file has, test data, and we can merge the 2 and we can see how we're doing. Our participation rate can then be a proxy for our completion rate, be a proxy for participation. But it's tough to monitor that way because they're not perfectly aligned. And the last thing, this does come up occasionally. CAST that also has an expectation of 95% participation rate. However, it's not on the dashboard, so there are no repercussions for it. It's actually reported by the state. The state reports it to the feds. Now that may change if we incorporate the CAST on the dashboard moving forward. I see my colleague keeps on getting kicked out, so I'll just keep on going, and hopefully she'll be able to get back in. So talk about graduation rate. So the grad rate, it's basically any student who earned a standard diploma is counted as a graduate, right? And this throws people sometimes because there are a lot of alternatives to the diploma, right? But it's only students with a standard diploma. I'm not including, for the purposes of this conversation, an alternative pathway to a diploma, which now exists for our students with disabilities who have the greatest needs, because you're highly unlikely to have seen any of those students because they would have had to have been a 9th grader last year, so you're not have gone all the way. But moving forward, there will be a pathway that will be included in your grad rate for those students who take the California alternate assessment, who could qualify for this. More conversation coming for that in Dan. And any LEAs or schools that serve grade 12 will receive a performance color for this indicator. So Important to note, it's a combined 4 and 5 year graduation rate for the grad rate indicator, which is a little bit different than DataQuest. So any student who graduates in 4 years is part of the most current graduating class or cohort, and students who graduate in 5 years if they were in the prior year, right? So it's kind of a positive outcome. So you only get held accountable for graduates in the 5th year in the numerator and the denominator if they graduate, right? And if a student transfers at the end of the year, it's the last school where a student is enrolled who's held accountable. So a little bit different than academic indicator. You got to get that student across the finish line. Hillary, you're back. Oh, should I just keep going, or do you want to run these? Okay, I'll keep going in case you. So just in terms of who's included in the numerator, right? So students who earn a regular high school diploma by end of the 4th or 5th year. And then importantly, this is a really big one, and I'm like trying to stress this with our CalPADS people, but it really is helpful for accountability people to know this too. Based on Senate Bill 523, which is an extension of many historical bills that preceded it, there are certain student groups, including foster youth, English learner newcomers, who are able to graduate and receive a standard diploma based on the state graduation requirements, right? And so those students could be incorporated because it is considered a standard diploma. So if you're looking forward this year for next year's grad rate, make sure you have a plan in place to capture students who would qualify for the state requirements and fit in one of those student groups to meet that requirement. What's not considered a graduate and therefore excluded are any students who graduate with a special ed certificate of completion, which is different than that alternative pathway that I was talking about a second ago. Any students with a high school equivalency certificate, adult ed high school diploma, or that the CHESP results. Those do not get included in the numerator. The denominator includes both students in the current 4-year grad rate, so they entered that school, as whatever year they entered, they could be, still 11th graders. They could be credit deficient, but at some point you should reset those. But they stick with their cohort wherever they entered. That's their cohort, as well as students who graduated in 5 years from the prior graduating class. So if they didn't graduate, if they roll into that 5th year and you're able to get them into the to the finish line the following year, they count, right? That's included in your denominator, but they do count positively, but only if they graduate in that 5th year. There are included in the denominator, this is where it gets dragged down. Any students who dropped out, all students who transferred in. So just because a student didn't start with you, they're still included. Any students who transferred but did not re-enroll in California public school, or they're basically what's called lost transfers. So students who left and you don't have documentation as to where they went. They were supposed to show up at a public school and they did not. You would be held accountable for those students. And then any early graduates, they show up in the denominator. They're also going to show up in your numerator too, fortunately. And any students who transferred to adult ed. And I see your question, Drew, and I'll get to it in just a second. Here's just kind of a breakdown chart. I'm just mindful of the time here, but there is a big distinction. And I think I just want to pull up because there is some of you may have heard, based on the fact that the dashboard will be released earlier and earlier over the next 3 years to eventually move to an October 15th release date. The state is having to change the deadlines for CalPADS as well. And one of the ramifications of that is likely that the deadline for summer, we used to have summer grads, right? Students who are maybe credit deficient at the end of the school year, but who managed to get through everything before August 15th, and you could roll it back. They could be included in your 4-year cohort graduation rate. That won't be the case anymore. It's going to be a pretty hard deadline of June 30th moving forward. But those students will still get picked up in your 5th year for the dashboard for accountability purposes. So the state doesn't see it as a huge impact on accountability. But if you are a district that uses the 4-year adjusted cohort grad rate, which is on DataQuest, that could be a factor, right? So if that's what you use, and you tend to catch a lot of students who graduate just immediately following the end of the school year, they're making stuff up in adult school or whatnot, there will be an impact there. So this is kind of the distinction between the two, but it's a blended rate for the dashboard. DataQuest also has a 5-year graduation rate, which is different than the blended rate. So they're very distinct. Just take a moment to look there. And just to note, the DAS graduation rate, that was a 1-year graduation rate. It's been eliminated. So for the purposes of Accountability, any alternative, any school that has a dashboard alternative school status, which is any continuation school, any defined in ed code alternative school automatically assigned DAS, as well as a lot of schools that have applied for it. They're held now to the 4-year comprehensive high school standard, which is this 4th and 5th year graduation rate. So those standalone schools definitely don't have this, the 1-year rate, which was a little more forgiving. However, it is still reported on the dashboard in an alternative report for the purposes of comparison. So they do continue to report that. So Drew, your question, if a student takes CHESP and passes but continues and graduates, do they still get excluded from the numerator? No. If they end up with a standard diploma and they just said they took the CHESP, but they end up with a standard diploma, they will be included in the numerator. We covered the 4- and 5-year grad rate applying to both DAS and non-DAS. That's the case. 4th year senior who's in the class of 2022. This is last year. We should update that. Student attended summer school, graduated August 15th. Will the student be included in the grad rate for class of 2022? They would be last year or this year. But moving forward in 2024, they have to have graduated by June 30th. So, but again, they'll be picked up. They will be picked up in the 5th year, but it takes a little bit for them to show up. So, college and career indicator, Hillary.
I'm gonna make sure I stay off mute and I can do this and I won't get kicked out. So very quickly because of time. So the college career indicator, or the CCI as we know it, represents the percentage of high school graduates who are prepared for college and career. This indicator is designed, as we know, to encourage high schools to provide all students with a rigorous, broad course of study that can prepare them for post-secondary success. This indicator, there are several combinations we'll kind of look at very briefly that students can achieve preparedness with. And just as a reminder again that the CCNI is going to only be reported as status for the 2023 year. So the next 2 slides, as you can see here, we have the descriptions for the college measures. And I won't read them all to you, but as you can see, all the kind of Klingon pieces, the add-ons, but the measures include things with smarter balance summative assessment, both AP and IB exams, and scores of 3 or 4 or higher on them. UC and CSU, A through G completion, college credit courses, and the state seal of biliteracy, which we've seen an uptick in the past year or so. If you wanted to, we zoom in on the UC and the CSU A through G completion measures. You can see how students can attain preparedness by meeting all those requirements. I know that we are looking forward to a nice, pretty visual that will kind of represent what both prepared and approaching prepared look like. As we swing over, though, to the career measures, we'll notice that we see what the CT pathway completion, registered pre-apprenticeships, military, leadership and science, state and federal jobs, and transitional work-based and classroom-based experience and exploration, which are also included for students with IEPs. Similarly to the college measures, the career measures have their own Klingons, as you can read, and we reference as well. I did want to take a minute to mention that the non-registered pre-apprenticeships, you will see them this year on the dashboard. They'll be reported. However, they're dropped in 2024 due to the very limited available data statewide. And some other measures that are not on here, but that are up for consideration for future dashboards, are going to include student-led enterprise, student internships, the ASVAB, or the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, and simulated work-based learning. And I believe right now we have the CDE. They're currently gathering data to better understand how LEA supports students through these opportunities. So more to come on those.
Yeah, and I just want to chime in on that because the way it works, and I kind of think this is a little bit of the cart leading the horse. The state asks people to start reporting these before they're clearly defined. I never quite understood this. I'm like, could you tell us more? What is a student-led enterprise? What qualifies? I spent many years in CTE, and so we used to have all sorts of virtual enterprise, other programs similarly. The state is actually leaves it wide open during the data collection process. And then when they get data, then they can go through and they kind of use the data that's submitted, because it's not being used for accountability, but they use the data that's submitted to determine what would be a normal, what kind of things are being reported, how many hours do they last, You know, what's a good amount of hours, and that's how they arrive at that. So it's kind of like people are like, I'm submitting this, but is it correct? Is this actually what you're talking about, an internship? And there's a lot of flexibility, I think, for some of them. Like an internship could be an internship on campus, like we used to do in RLP, or does it have to be an internship that's recognized? Just report the data. If you have any influence over that, just report it for now. They'll work it out later, but they need to see data coming in order to decide, oh, it's relevant. There are a lot of LEAs that are reporting this data. If you have any of it, report it. It's kind of all reported in the same place, but don't worry about whether it meets the state standards because they haven't determined the standards yet. They're just asking you to submit it so they can make that determination.
And here's the display status for the 2023 dashboard for College Career Indicator. You'll notice it's just going to have the 5 status levels of very high, high, medium, low, and very low. And the colors are not going to be reported. We also have this linked in the appendix. And can the same student be counted more than once throughout the report? For example, if the student passes 2 AP exams and completes A through G requirements, would this student be included in the numerator for AP exams as well as A through G completion? And in short, yes. If the student completes more than one of these measures, then that student's going to be included more than once throughout the 2022 College Career Measures only report. So an example above, they're included in the numerator for the AP exams and included in the numerator for the A through G completion.
That's on the report. What you will see, and that's why it's confusing, is the percentage of students that'll be reported as having, it's unduplicated. When you see it on the dashboard this year, a student, if they meet the prepared level, it's just one time, right? But they do appear in the subsequent report as at multiple levels. So that's good to know. When you look at the data, I'm trying to understand. I don't understand how can we have so many students who met the participant. It doesn't add up to 100%. Is what this question is getting at, and it's important to understand that a student can be prepared in multiple ways when you're looking at that. So we're going to dive in and talk about DA. I know we're getting short on time, so I'm going to kind of, there's more to come on this, but just in terms of what is DA, I am surprised if there's a district here who wasn't in DA last year, raise your hand, because it was basically everybody, 63 districts, but this year it's a little bit different. So the differentiated assistance is targeted technical assistance under California's LCFF accountability system. And it's really intended as that tier 2, like think of it like an MTSS model. So everybody receives general assistance, like in our regular DAN meetings or in this type of meeting. But then if a school or a district, I should say, is identified for differentiated assistance or a charter school moving forward, they will receive additional supports to help them in a systemic way. It's not a penalty. It's not intended as any kind of punitive measure. It really is, in essence, an opportunity to lean in on your colleagues at the county office and get whatever help you can get for whatever problems you feel are most pressing for you. It's not a status or a label. It's not reported out on the dashboard. It's really internal. It's just between basically the county or if you're a charter, the LE authorizing LEA and you. This year, eligibility, the criteria basis is set on by the state board. It includes those 8 state priority areas, which includes a mix of both state and local indicators. And then county offices have 2 additional indicators that we are held accountable for. And charter schools have to be, this was a change this year. They used to be, it was a 4-year period, 3 years out of 4. Now it's changed, it's 2 years worth of eligibility. But these are the criteria, right? So if you, and your local performance, your local indicators, really, if you don't meet the criteria of basically going through the self-reflection tool, presenting to your board in conjunction with the LCAP and uploading it, then you'll be identified as standard not met or standard not met for 2 years. There are probably going to be some LEAs that didn't do that. But most folks, we send out lots of emails because we want everybody to get standard met here. It doesn't require meeting any kind of objective criteria. It's just a matter of going through the processes. However, the others are, and this will be kind of a shift backwards. It's been a while. So you got pupil achievement. Last year it was just both were very low, but this year it's returning to get a mix. So either both indicators are red, or one indicator is red and the other is orange, or red on the LP. And so we have the LP this year. So it only applies to the EL student group. And you couldn't have both. Like if you had your English learners were eligible because they got red on ELA and orange on math and red on the LP, that wouldn't count. They have to have it in a different priority area. So then the others are for pupil engagement, read on graduation rate, or chronic absenteeism. And that's a good stuff the band question. Why is chronic absenteeism only K through 8? It's because we're already holding high schools accountable with the grad rate for pupil engagement. School climate is that suspension rate is the primary state indicator, or then the local performance for school climate local indicator. And then access to broad course study, another local indicator, and then outcomes for broad courses study. That is the college and career indicator. So this year a little bit different. It's also going to have that just the very low, it'll be the status of this year. So it's very low status only. And so there are 3 ways as potentially an LEA would be identified. And this is district or charter school this year. Charter would be more, but is that you could be state indicators only, a single student group meeting the criteria in at least 2 priority areas, or local indicators. And in all likelihood, if you didn't meet one local indicator, you're not going to meet any of them because they all kind of get submitted at the same time, or a combination, right? So potentially you could have a combination of not meeting a state indicator as well as a local indicator. Now, local indicators apply across all student groups. So any student group would be eligible in conjunction. So charter school eligibility. So this is how this has changed for charter schools. As I mentioned, it's now 2 or more years. And what has also changed is that last year they would have been eligible. We had 162 charter schools who were eligible, would have been eligible last year. And so any of those 162, if they're eligible again this year, and they could meet the criteria in the aforementioned ways, they would be eligible for differentiated assistance. So they met it in 22 and again in 23. Importantly, it doesn't have to be the same indicators and it doesn't have to be the same student group. So they could have met it for a completely different set of student groups and indicators in 22 and in 23. Going to blow quickly through these. So here we see kind of the timeline for the charter schools, right? So you can see they are going to be identified for a single year of differentiated assistance, any charter schools to meet. There's a new legislation for districts. Any district that meets the eligibility criteria for differentiated assistance on the 2023 dashboard will be eligible for DA for 2 years. And each subsequent year, if you would continue to be eligible, that 2 years would be extended. So quickly on comprehensive support and improvement. So these are a little bit weird because you can't actually know what these are, who's eligible till well after the release of the dashboard, because it takes some calculations. So there's the standardized low graduation rate, which is a 3-year average. So CSI low grad rate, then there's CSI low performing, and those are schools that are identified after all the low grad rate schools have been identified. Any schools, Title I schools remaining then are eligible, and they're considered, the state board looks at the criteria that are available and they apply it to the all students level, and they have to identify no less than 5%. So that's why it's a little bit of a variable. So they have to look at where everybody falls, and they can't, like, there are up to 5 different levels of criteria, and they have to go until they've identified at least 5% of students. And that's going to be a standard they can only meet once the dashboard is finalized. So that's why it takes a little bit of extra time. And so, for example, last year, the CSI low performing criteria, when we only had status, was all indicators lowest status level, or all indicators lowest status level, but 1 indicator. And it was kind of tricky because you could have 2 indicators and one could be, very low. This happened to a lot of people. Chronic absenteeism was very low, and one other indicator for a student, for all students, could have been very high, could have been really good, but one in very low and one of any other color. So that takes a while to calculate all that. And I see your question, Julianne. I'll get there in just 1 second. ATSI then follows the same rules for that CSI did in terms of criteria, but it's applied to all schools, regardless of Title I status. And it only uses the rules that were applied for CSI. So if they get to the second tranche and they say, okay, we've met our criteria for the 5% minimum, only those rules are applied to determine ATSI schools. However, they're applied at the student group level. So if you had a student group who met those criteria, they would be identified for ATSI. And very importantly, this year is the first year of the 3 years. So the rules are you're supposed to establish a list every 3 years. and schools are identified and they stay on it unless they exit. And we don't have time to talk about exit criteria. But last year, because the way the dashboard was constructed, and they knew they'd have such different changes, last year was a 1-year list. So everybody is being reconsidered this year as though it were first year for identification for CSI and ATSI. And here's just a breakdown of the kind of two differences in terms of when the notification will come. DA will be notified upon release of the dashboard. That'll be immediate. The ESSA eligibility, they said early spring, late winter. So basically somewhere January or February, you'll get that list will be released. They have different criteria, so you qualify for one or not. So let me answer Juliana. At some point, if CSI schools have been in the status for enough years, the LEAs will be part of DA. Do you know what year that will begin? I'm going to have to get back to you on that, Juliana. I can though tell you CCI will factor into CSI, ATSI. So the criteria will include, it'll be kind of funky, but it'll be like last year, it'll be all the other criteria, and I had it earlier, and CCI status of very low. So that'll be the proxy for red. So you can kind of factor it in that way. But yes, an LEA can qualify for both DA and CSI, ATSI, if you're a charter school, that is. So charters could be both differentiated assistance eligible and ATSI eligible because it's student groups, but it's not automatic. So they are different rules apply. We're hitting the wall here, and if you have to drop off, completely understand, but we are recording, so we will make this recording available as soon as possible. I appreciate all of you who are hanging in.
So some ideas to consider when engaging our educational partners in a conversation around the 2023 dashboard should include setting the stage with some historical context for an accurate, honest, and a complete picture of your LEA and school over time, focusing on students as a whole before disaggregating that data into student program or race and ethnicity can also help to provide foundational knowledge for novice partners, and it can also kind of assuage those anxieties that others may have. Keep in mind that engaging the educational partners in a conversation, it includes asking questions and providing opportunities for people to ask questions and learn. So leveraging data analysis protocols, those can help to facilitate the conversations, and they provide our educational partners an opportunity to present their noticings or their wonderings with regards to the data that they see. Telling your story with data, as you can see on the next slide. I like this visual, kind of captures the organization of the data for purposes of telling your story. So as the 2023 dashboard is released, you're also going to want to consider other data pieces that are not necessarily included that can provide a more complete picture of student learning. Maybe something that's qualitative from a focus group, maybe speaking to school climate data about students and their perceptions of safety and connectedness. But gathering your data, kind of sorting it out and arranging it, presenting it, and then kind of explaining what the story allows your educational partners an opportunity to engage and ask questions. There are some best practices and some tips for sharing data with family is kind of keeping them, selecting the type of data that you want to use is going to be key, but keeping them engaged in dialogue. So helping them to understand the context of the data, as I said, providing tips and ideas and resources available on your site, at your district website, on your school websites, having access to your LCAP or your SIPSA, the goals of the school and the district. Those are significant pieces that help provide that contextual information for educational partners. And using your existing family engagement opportunities when you're thinking about your systems, whether that's through your DLAC communities or your local site governing board, school site council, or ELAC. Those are also ways that you can engage families in dialogue around the data. And before we turn it over to Evan again, just a reminder about the CDE, the dashboard toolkit and messaging. I know that every day we're on there kind of looking and it's being populated little by little. And as we get closer to the December 15th, I'm sure a lot of those will be popping, but the dashboard communication toolkit with all those flyers and PDFs, they also have some webinars and some things to check out that can help to build capacity both internally and with partners. The principles that we spoke to earlier, we also have, and they're linked both here and on the dashboard toolkit. There's also a put on by the city fall 2023 dashboard Q&A session registration. I believe the next day or so, they actually have their first session coming up.
Yeah, we have that flyer uploaded on the Canvas page.
Okay, great.
Yep.
And
So
then
reminder.
lastly, for, as Evan says, all of the people that want to nerd out to CalPads and speak CalPadding, or those who are just trying to build their capacity and understanding, the 2023 Connecting CalPads to the Dashboard Handbook. Ooh, demo. Is there.
Thanks, Hillary. Sorry
Yeah.
to push you to say Max.
Let's go.
Oh, so just a couple things about looking at data, and most of you, I'm sure, have a fairly robust data system, but this may be useful for your site level leadership as well, or maybe some of you as well. And just in terms of how best to look at it and how, I think the dashboard is intended to be used. First of all, that dashboard equity report, like drill down that one level, right? So you can get down to, because, in this case, look, the suspension rate for this district looks great. And this is from 2019. This is not one of our districts, but it's a very diverse district. But you can see, oh, they're green, that looks good. But then when you drill down and you actually see, no, there's student groups that have one group in red, they're yellow student groups. So that's an important one that we really urge school leaders and district leaders to have parents and everyone understand, just because it gets at those equity issues. Also, within your view additional reports, this is a favorite within the LCAP team. And the reason I think this is it's called the student group report, and there are a number of things. If we had time, I'd do a little dive into it. But under the view additional reports, if you haven't seen this report, definitely check it out when your dashboard comes out. But it's great because you can see at a glance all student groups across all indicators, and the all student groups is at the top. And so you can quickly establish where the gaps are, both the gaps between any individual student group and the all students, and any student groups, any gaps that exist, right? So it's a great for at a glance. This, again, we haven't had all the colors, so this is what we'll see when we get the new 2023 dashboard out. We don't have time to go into any more. I apologize for running so long over as it is, but we just point out we've got lots of cut scores. All those are included. We are happy to take any, if you had still lingering questions, we are happy to have you join us for our DAN meetings. If you're not a member of our DAN meetings, we do those. There's one coming up in, off the top of my head,
December 6th.
December 6th, thank you. And we'll definitely be addressing more dashboard stuff then. But we thank you for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you in the very near future. I'm going to stop recording, and if you had any questions you were afraid to ask on camera, you can ask them now. Hold on.